You've heard of Annabelle. You know the story of Robert the Doll. But in the high-altitude colonial cities of Bolivia, locals whisper a different name in fear, a name tied to a tragedy so profound it stained an innocent plaything forever. They call her La Popo. This isn't just another ghost story. It's an account of a real-world legend, a cursed doll that doesn't just move. It remembers, it resents, and it wants something from anyone foolish enough to find it. My name is Julian Croft, and for a decade, I made a living chasing ghosts. Not literally, of course. I was a journalist, a debunker. My specialty was folklore, urban legends, and the mass hysteria that often followed them. I'd travel to so-called haunted locations, listen to the local tales, and write articles that peeled back the superstition to reveal a very logical, very boring core. It was a good gig. Until I heard about La Popo. The story came to me through a stringer in La Paz, a man named Mateo. He mentioned it casually, a piece of local color for a larger article I was writing on Andean myths. It's a children's story, mostly, he'd said over a crackling line. A boogeyman to keep kids from misbehaving. But there was a hesitation in his voice that caught my professional ear. The legend in its simplest form was about a doll, a beautiful European-made porcelain doll brought to Sucre, Bolivia, in the early 20th century. It was a gift for a young girl from a wealthy family named Elena. Elena was a sickly child, often confined to her room. The doll, which she named Popo, became her only friend. She told it her secrets, shared her fears, and held it tight during the long, painful nights. Then, as these stories often go, Elena died. The family, consumed by grief, packed away her belongings, including the doll. But the connection between the girl and her silent friend was not severed. Locals claimed Elena's lonely, resentful spirit had latched on to the one thing that gave her comfort. It had moved into the doll. Over the years, the house was sold, and the doll was lost, sold, or given away. But wherever it went, misfortune followed. Whispers, sickness, the sound of a little girl crying in empty rooms. It was standard folklore fare, a carbon copy of a dozen other haunted doll stories. But Mateo added one last, chilling detail. They say she doesn't just haunt the place, he whispered. She gets inside your head. She learns what you love. And then she takes it. That was the hook. The psychological element was new, a devious twist on a tired trope. I booked a flight to Sucre the next day. Sucre is known as the White City, a beautiful colonial relic nestled in the mountains. Its pristine white walls and red-tiled roofs seemed a world away from such dark tales. My first week was fruitless. I interviewed historians, librarians, and longtime residents. Most offered a polite smile and a shrug. They knew the story as a ghost tale for tourists, nothing more. A few older people grew visibly uncomfortable when I mentioned the name La Popo. An old woman selling textiles in the Mercado Central crossed herself and refused to speak to me further. Her fear was genuine. It was the first crack in my skepticism. Mateo's contacts eventually led me to a man named Hector. He was a junk dealer, an antique scavenger of sorts, living on the dusty outskirts of the city. His shop was a chaotic tomb of forgotten things. Hector was a stooped man with eyes that had seen too much dust and too little sunlight. He claimed to have owned the doll once. "A curse, that thing," he rasped, wiping his hands on an oily rag. "I bought it from an estate sale 30 years ago. The family was desperate to get rid of it." He said the first night it was in his shop, all the clocks stopped at 3:15 a.m., the exact time, he later learned, that Elena had died. The following week, he heard a child humming a lullaby from the back room where the doll was stored. He lived alone. The final straw was when his prized possession, a silver locket from his deceased wife, vanished. He found it a day later, nestled in the doll's cold porcelain hands. "She takes what you love," Hector repeated Mateo's words, his voice trembling. He sold it for almost nothing to a collector, a foreigner, and never looked back. He gave me the collector's name, Alistair Finch. Finch was an eccentric British expat who had died a few years prior. His vast collection of Bolivian artifacts had been auctioned off. My investigation hit another dead end. Frustrated, I decided to track down the original family home. It was a grand, decaying colonial mansion near the city center, now converted into apartments. I spoke to a family living in what would have been Elena's old room. They spoke of cold spots, of their young daughter complaining about a girl who would whisper to her from the closet at night. They thought it was an imaginary friend. I placed a digital audio recorder in the room that night, with their permission. I told them it was to measure atmospheric changes. I retrieved it the next morning and spent hours listening to the playback. There was nothing but the ambient sounds of the old house, until the very end of the recording. At 3:14 a.m., I heard it. A faint, clear sound. The sound of a small music box playing a tinny, sad melody, and underneath it a whisper, a girl's voice, speaking a single word in Spanish. Mio. Mine. A cold dread, foreign and unwelcome, settled in my stomach. This was no longer just a story. My obsession solidified. I had to find the doll. I spent 2 more weeks digging through auction manifests and contacting collectors. Finally, I got a hit. The doll hadn't been sold at the main auction. It was considered to be in poor condition and was lumped into a box of miscellaneous junk. That box was purchased by a small, forgotten antique shop in the very same city. The shop was called El Baúl del Tiempo, the Trunk of Time. It was a dark, cramped space that smelled of mothballs and decay. And there, sitting on a high shelf covered in a thick layer of dust, was a porcelain doll. Her blue glass eyes stared blankly into the middle distance. Her yellowed lace dress was torn at the hem. A network of hairline cracks marred her pale face. It was her. It had to be. The shopkeeper, a weary-looking woman, sold it to me for a pittance. "Take it," she said with an air of relief. "It gives the other items nightmares." I thought she was joking. I carried the doll back to my hotel room, my heart a strange mix of triumph and trepidation. She was heavier than she looked. There was a coldness to the porcelain that seemed to seep into my skin. I set her on the desk facing the wall, a strange, instinctual need to avoid her gaze. I set up my equipment, 2 cameras, the audio recorder, and an EMF meter. The first few hours were silent. The EMF meter stayed quiet. The doll remained motionless. I began to feel foolish, a grown man spooked by a child's toy. I ordered room service and tried to work on my notes, pointedly ignoring the figure on my desk. But the feeling of being watched was immense. It was a palpable pressure at the back of my neck. Around midnight, I decided to go to sleep. I left the equipment running. I placed the doll inside the empty closet and shut the door firmly. My sleep was a tormented, feverish thing. I dreamt I was in Elena's room, the air thick with the smell of sickness. A little girl was in the bed, her breath shallow. She was holding the doll. She looked at me, her eyes dark with pain, and whispered, "She's lonely. Don't leave her alone." I woke up in a cold sweat. The room was pitch black and silent. Then I heard it. A soft, scraping sound. Scrape, scrape, scrape. It was coming from the closet. My blood turned to ice. I lay paralyzed, listening as the sound continued, slow and deliberate. It sounded like a fingernail being dragged down the inside of the wooden door. The scraping stopped. Silence. Then, a soft click. The closet door handle turned. The door began to creak open. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. A sliver of hallway light cut through the darkness as the door opened wider. A small silhouette stood in the doorway. It was the size of a child. But it was the doll. She was standing on her own. She took one stiff, jerky step into the room, then another. Her head was tilted at an unnatural angle, her glass eyes seeming to find me in the dark. I finally found my voice and let out a strangled cry. I lunged for the bedside lamp, my hand fumbling for the switch. I flicked it on. The light flooded the room. The doll was sitting on the floor, motionless, right where the silhouette had been. Her head was now facing me directly. A tiny, cruel smile seemed to play on her cracked lips. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I sat on the bed, staring at the doll until the sun came up. When morning arrived, I checked my footage. The camera facing the closet had been turned off remotely at 3:14 a.m. The audio recorder, however, had kept running. I listened. I heard the scraping. I heard the doorknob turn. And then, I heard the whisper again, right next to the microphone. Sugar. Play. That was enough. My investigation was over. My skepticism was a shattered ruin. I had to get rid of her. I packed my bags, leaving the doll sitting in the middle of the room. I checked out, telling the hotel staff I had to leave unexpectedly. I didn't look back. At the airport, I felt a profound sense of relief as my plane took off. It was over. I landed in Miami for my layover, my body aching with exhaustion. I went to the restroom to splash some water on my face. As I dried my hands, I noticed a child's drawing on the counter left behind. It was a crayon drawing of a little girl with a doll with a yellow dress and cracked face. A cold knot formed in my gut. I dismissed it as a coincidence. My mind was playing tricks on me. I boarded my final flight home. I tried to sleep, but the dream of Elena's room replayed in my mind. When I landed and went to the baggage claim, my suitcase was one of the first to appear. As I grabbed it, I noticed something was wrong. One of the latches was unbuckled. I thought it might have been damaged during the flight. I got home, my apartment a sanctuary of logic and reason. I dropped the suitcase on the floor of my bedroom and unzipped it. My clothes were disheveled, thrown about. And sitting right on top of them, staring up at me with her vacant blue eyes, was La Popo. Her lace dress was pristine. The tear at the hem was gone. She looked brand new. A scream died in my throat. It was impossible. I had left her thousands of miles away in a hotel room. There was no rational explanation. My mind snapped. I grabbed the doll, ignoring the chilling cold of her body, and ran out of my apartment. I drove to the nearest bridge, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. I stood on the edge, the doll in my hand, and I threw her with all my might into the dark, swirling water below. I watched until I was sure she was gone. I felt a wave of hysterical relief. I drove home, shaking. I triple-bolted my door and collapsed onto my sofa. I must have fallen asleep because I woke to the sound of music. A music box. The same sad, tinny melody from the recording in Sucre. It was coming from my bedroom. With a sense of final, soul-crushing dread, I forced myself to my feet. I walked to the bedroom door. I pushed it open. La Popo was sitting on my pillow. She was perfectly dry. In her lap was a photograph from my nightstand. It was the only picture I had of my younger sister, who had died from a childhood illness years ago. Hector's words echoed in my mind. She takes what you love. The entity wasn't just in the doll anymore. It was attached to me. The following weeks were a private hell. She didn't always move. Sometimes she would just appear in different places. In the passenger seat of my locked car. In the refrigerator atop the milk carton. At the foot of my bed, watching me sleep. The whispers started. Not just on recordings, but in my own ears. A little girl's voice, humming, crying, giggling from the next room. She started calling my sister's name. She wanted to remind me of my loss. She was feeding on my grief. I tried everything. I contacted priests, shamans, paranormal experts. One priest attempted an exorcism. As he began to pray, the doll's head slowly spun 180 degrees to face him. A deep, guttural laugh, not of a child, erupted from it. The crucifix in the priest's hand grew scorching hot, burning his palm. He fled my apartment in terror. I tried locking her in a safe. The next morning, the safe was open, and she was sitting on top of it. I tried burying her in the woods. I found her in my bed that night, covered in dirt, a single dead wildflower clutched in her hand. There was no getting rid of her. She wasn't a possession. She was a companion. And I was her new Elena. My life fell apart. I lost my job. My friends thought I was having a breakdown. I couldn't blame them. I became a recluse, a prisoner in my own home, haunted by a porcelain tyrant. I realized the legend had it wrong. The doll wasn't the curse. The curse was the loneliness of the spirit within. It didn't want to harm me. It just wanted to play. Forever. My final attempt was based on a desperate theory. The spirit was tied to the doll because it was Elena's most beloved object. What if it was no longer an object of love? What if it was an object of pure, unadulterated hatred? One night, I set her in the center of the living room floor. I grabbed a hammer from my toolbox. As I approached, the air grew freezing cold. The lights flickered and died. A piercing scream filled with a child's rage and sorrow echoed through the apartment. "No!" the voice shrieked inside my head. I ignored it. I raised the hammer high above my head. I brought it down on her placid, smiling face. The sound of shattering porcelain was the loudest thing I had ever heard. A blast of icy wind erupted from the doll, throwing me back against the wall. The scream intensified into an unholy shriek, and then suddenly there was silence. The power came back on. The oppressive cold vanished. I looked at the floor. The doll was in 100 pieces. The curse was broken. That was 6 months ago. I moved away. I have a new name. I don't talk about what happened. I tell this story now only as a warning. Do not go looking for monsters. Do not seek out the dark places and the sad stories. Some things want to be found, because sometimes, late at night, when the house is quiet, I still hear it. The faint, sad melody of a music box, and a little girl whispering my name from just outside the door.